There are no new ideas, but ideas are not eternal, in spite of what Plato said. We have to keep reinventing the same ideas over and over again. If there were such a thing as an idea that was immortal and would live without us, then we wouldn't have anything to do. But because we die, and because knowledge in the form of ideas can't be transferred directly, everyone has to invent them all over again for themselves. And part of what our social existence is about helping each other do that. No one does it alone. None of us human beings do it alone. None. And so even though there are no new ideas, it's as though they're new when we have to bring them out of nothing again, out of the nothingness of our existence. Well, I was born in 1940 in Lansing, Michigan, a town I lived in for 6 months, and have no recollection of. This was just at the beginning of the period that became World War II. And my father was a West Point graduate and had been to West Point in the 20s and graduated. But there was nothing to do as a military officer at that time, so he resigned his commission and became a civil engineer for the Pennsylvania Railroad. But as the war drew closer, it was clear that the U.S. was going to be involved in a war, that he re-enlisted as a major in the Army and began to move. And within a year or two after my birth, the war had started, and so we were moving all over the United States. And he died in 1952, and my mother and I, because I was the only child of that marriage, moved back to Indiana, which was her home state, where I went to high school. In fact, I went to the same high school Michael Graves went to. Yeah, Shortridge High School. And Kurt Vonnegut, another famous alumnus of Shortridge High School. Then I wanted to study architecture, but there was no state school of architecture in Indiana at that time. So I had to go, first of all, to School of Engineering, which turned out to be a very good thing for me, to build up my credentials, my university credentials, to enter a very good school, which I did in 1960 at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, which is where I went to the School of Architecture. If you're doing work on a certain level, it's always autobiographical. Certainly in my case, the kind of itinerant and, in a way, rootless in terms of a particular place, the way of life I knew as a child certainly impacted my later work and made my interest, in a sense, in solving my own problem. Because I had the problem of being a kind of wanderer, and that presents certain problems. So, in a sense, through architecture, through my work as an architect, I've been trying to resolve that on a very personal level in the first place. But naturally, seeing that others have that same problem, that we live in this kind of mobile and itinerant society, even as long ago as the 40s, I began to think, well, maybe there are others who have the same problem they're trying to solve. So I would hope that the work in that sense becomes public. It becomes, at least it addresses certain people in the society who are trying to find a way to live in this highly fluid or rootless condition. The fact that my father was a military officer and the fact that I grew up around the military, I don't think directly resulted in my involvement with the concept of war and architecture. I think it was more indirect in the sense that my interest in engineering, in a way, the practical problems of building army bases and of trying to construct things in kind of remote regions. Tennessee, for example, where my father was in charge of building a major test facility for jet engines. And this had to be built It wasn't far from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, by the way, where they first distilled plutonium. I think that this somehow prepared me for looking at things in a certain way. Because even in engineering, there's a certain poetic, and particularly in the idea of dealing with complex and difficult practical problems, there is a kind of romance to that. At least I found it so. I never thought of it as only being simple pragmatics. So I think that was more part of it than the military aspect. And of course, when I first went to Sarajevo in 1991, I was already doing work in former Yugoslavia, at least on a theoretical level, and the war hadn't started yet. And the last thing I expected to do was to get drawn into some idea of war. It had not really been on my mind. But I became involved, and then I brought to the questions that were raised in my mind in Sarajevo and in Croatia, former Yugoslavia during the war. I brought to those my older sense of dealing with complex problems in remote places, you might say. That, I would say, more is the direct link. But what's interesting is I mentioned my father was an engineer, because West Point graduates at that time graduated as engineers. And I often wondered how I chose architecture. And then I was looking through some old pictures of my father in his office, his military office. He was a colonel in the Air Force. And suddenly I saw these renderings of buildings in the background. They were these military buildings. And I realized I'd grown up around these pictures of, well, it's certainly not distinguished looking architecture, but I'd grown up around this idea of projecting building through drawing. And it was kind of a revelation to me, because I hadn't really realized how much that had impacted me as a child, growing up around that. But then there were the airplanes, because I lived on Army bases, Air Force bases, like Patterson Field in Ohio, which was a big SAC base, a Strategic Air Command base in the 50s. This is in the early 50s. And we'd go down to the flight line, because we were living on the base as a bunch of kids. I was 11 or 12 years old. And we watched the planes taking off and landing. We'd sit in the cafe and the pilots would come in. We'd just watch them. It was so amazing, these guys flying these big metal things, So I think but that was more, it was less to do with the idea of war, because I didn't associate those things with war. I associated them more with this constructional aspect and the romance of construction. So I think all of those were factors that finally, when I was drawn into this Sarajevo situation, again I brought that knowledge or that memory into the situation, but on a new level. Certainly nothing that I had ever thought of when I was a child. To some extent, I'm in mourning, and people who wear black, they say, well, you're depressed, you wear black. Well, I am depressed. I'm mourning certain aspects of my own existence and of what I see around me. This goes back to the idea of pessimism or optimism. I think that I'm basically a pessimist. And I don't want any rose-colored lenses and kind of optimistic projections about how everything's going to turn out fine. I don't think it probably will turn out fine. But I think that then the challenge to live becomes, well, what can you do with that? What can you do if it's not going to turn out fine? If your whole life is based on the fact it's all going to come up the right way or the way you want, well, that's one way to operate. But if you really realize that death is going to cancel you out, and that human fallibility and the general nature of the human condition is such that probably it all gets canceled out one way or the other. Now, what can you do with that? That's a much more interesting challenge to me as a human being than to affect some optimistic view of life. So the black has to do very much with that starting point. Let's start with the darkness, and let's see what kind of light we can create out of it. My meeting with Heinz Von Foester was a little bit like I was describing a moment ago about the tremendous impact that growing up the way I did had on my later work, but it was rather unconscious. I'm sorry to say, I wish I had been so self-aware, so young, that I was aware of all those early influences. But I wasn't. At the time I met Heinz, I was a student at the university in the School of Architecture, and his son was also, Andreas. And we became friends, and so he would invite me over to his father and mother's house. And Andy, or Andreas, had two brothers, one Tom and one John, both of whom were in physics. But I met Heinz that way, and they were the first Europeans I had ever known, for example. Even though growing up in the United States, in the military environment, I just knew Americans. And we're talking 1960, and I hadn't traveled in Europe. So it was interesting to see the difference, the way they approached just their organizing their house. And they were, in a way, very social people, because there were all kinds of academics passing from Europe through the university, which is a major, especially at that time, was a major university in computers, computer science, in physics, mathematics, music, and all the rest. So they had this kind of soirees, And I was just this young guy kind of saying, oh, this is pretty amazing, all this stuff going on, all this conversation. So on one level, it was a deeply warm personal contact with his family that was very good for me. And educational. I mean, I just learned a lot about people that I hadn't known before. What he was doing in the laboratory, in his biological computer laboratory, was something that I only gradually became aware of over the next few years. I do remember one time I went to their house, and I remember asking Heinz, I was trying to be extremely intelligent, of course, and I said, well, which theory of light do you believe in, the particle or the wave theory? And he said, well, whichever one works at the moment, whichever one works for me at the moment. I was stunned. I thought, well, doesn't he believe in one or the other? I mean, isn't there a conviction? But of course, he was a scientist, and also he understood something which I didn't know, which is this particle wave duality. In other words, that it's both, really, and it's neither, and so forth. So these were the beginnings of my awareness of his work. Later, I worked with him, made illustrations. Some of these books that I brought to Vico Morcote have some of these little illustrations that I made for his papers, because he didn't want that kind of cold scientific diagram. He wanted handwriting. He wanted to see the hand of an artist, on his illustrations for his very technical papers. Gradually, I absorbed, because I never had him as a teacher, but I absorbed things through working with him that, again, I didn't realize till many years later. I didn't realize how much they impacted my view of the world, my way of thinking about things, my idea of knowledge, because Heinz is very much an epistemologist. He's very much interested in what is knowledge. How do we know what we know, and why do we think we know it? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to phrase it. So it was only many years later that I began to realize how much this had impacted my thinking as an architect. And Heinz, what he thinks of my work has always been a matter of interest and frustration to me, because he very much believes that this isn't Heinz von Foester view of the world. It's mine. And it's not the same as his. And it's very important to him that each individual develop their own interpretation of ideas, their own way of seeing things. So I've never quite understood what he really thought of my work, except that he considered it very inventive. However, but I knew there were certainly things he didn't agree with. or that I had interpreted differently than maybe he had intended. But he respects my right to interpret these ideas in the way that I do. But I think he was a decisive influence, but it only became clear to me over time, over many years. The question of whether there's a recursion between memory and desire, between the present, what we want to do, and yet what we bring from the past with us, almost certainly there is. In cybernetics, of course, there is the belief that we are in a closed system neurologically with our environment, so we don't really have access to so-called objective knowledge. We only have access to the knowledge that we have within this closed system. Now, whether you take that rigid a view or not, either way around, there is this interactive feedback quality where you're constantly recycling your own material. I mean, maybe this is most clear in literature. Writers who draw on the material of their experience and keep reworking that experience over and over again. And each time they write a novel, of course, it changes their memory of the experience. You know? This is one of the key things, is that when we do have this recursion, it's not the same old stuff going round and round and round. We keep transforming it. We make it into something new every time we reinterpret it. And I think that's an important aspect of our reuse of our own experience. Because that's all we have at the end. We don't really have universal truth. We don't have knowledge of the absolute. We only have what we've experienced. And that's got to be the basis of our work. And by the way, our communication with each other. Our social existence has to be based just on our individual experiences and how we're able to exchange those. Now, I don't consider myself a scientist or philosopher at all, because that implies a much more systematic, according to the rules of science or philosophy. I mean, that's systematic thinking. Oddly enough, I consider myself an architect. And I think that, obviously, in my definition of architecture, one has to include many, many things. Architecture is not just the technical manifestations or dimensions of the craft or the trade of building or of design. But this is a very old-fashioned idea of architecture, because today it tends to be much more specialized, like most fields, where you are an expert in certain things. So the idea of the architect as a generalist is not a very appealing idea today. And I would say one of the main reasons is that people today are very suspicious of general knowledge. We only believe in specialists, experts, who can prove that they know some particular thing in all of its ramifications. So a generalist might be considered a dilettante or an amateur. But architects have to be generalists. We have to integrate a wide field of knowledge. So we have to take the risk of being generalists. Now, obviously, there are certain areas where we are technically specialized, highly specialized. But these other interests of philosophy, that are covered in the humanities, for example, history, science, we have to somehow glean the essential concepts and integrate them into a worldview that informs our idea of architecture and our specific work, the way we design. It's a risk. I think that people who think of my work as deconstructivist don't understand it. Let me put it this way. Deconstructivism was a kind of fake avant-garde movement in the late 80s, manufactured by Philip Johnson and Peter Eisenman, with the help of a few others in New York. And they noticed that there was a certain visual affinity between the works of certain architects. And so they chose to try to say this was a united group, or they could be united under this deconstructivist mentality just because of these affinities, ignoring the differences, say, between the work of Zaha Hadid and Kwame Blau, or Eisenman and Zaha Hadid. I mean, so it was just a phony attempt to make a neo-art movement. Now, deconstruction, on the other hand, as a branch of literary theory and of cultural theory, is something that I won't say it's influenced me, because we both trace back to the same sources. That route I was telling you about earlier through Heinz Von Foester and cybernetics, deconstructivist comes out of that same set of roots. Theories that were evolved in the 30s, 40s, 50s about social and cultural theories. Later influenced people like Foucault and Derrida and Paul de Man and other thinkers in the same way that, well, I was influenced by the same ideas but through a different channel. I think there are common elements. For example, one in deconstruction, the literary theory, is that there is no inherent meaning in the text, that it has to be interpreted. Structuralist theories always looked for the meaning that had been put into the text by the author or by the cultural condition, and the task was to find that, to discover what was there. And deconstruction said, well, really, there's nothing there. There's only, this sort of semiotic field, this field of signs that have to be interpreted all over again. And that's a point of view, if you look at a concept of mine like free space, where I'm saying there is no inherent purpose in the abstraction of architectural space. One has to create the purpose by acting in the space, by being in the space. Otherwise, there's nothing inherent, you see? So I think that's a parallel with deconstruction as a theory. But forget deconstructivist or deconstructivism. It's nothing real. It never happened. It was just a PR event. I suppose, for me, the ARCA Graham group in the 60s was, like a lot of people, made a big impact. When they first started publishing their work, it just made a tremendous impact in the field of architecture. And you can find many. I even believe that Robert Venturi was transformed by Archigram. He'd never admit it, but I think the populism inherent in Venturi's work comes out of that Archigram movement. The idea of introducing a kind of new dynamic and freedom of thought. Now, oddly enough, Peter Cook, who is I'm happy to say is a good colleague of mine now. He's only 4 or 5 years older than me. But at that time, these young guys in their early 20s were changing the whole way we thought of architecture. So I was out in the middle of Illinois, just astonished. I was only a couple of years younger than they were. So it was just those funny historical coincidences. It's the same time with Heinz Von Foester, and if you want to make a connection or a link, you'd say Cedric Price, who was very influential on Archigram, was working with Gordon Pask, systems theorist and cyberneticist, who I met at the University of Illinois in Heinz Von Foester's biological computer laboratory. Pask was one of the thinkers, scientists who was coming there to explore new concepts. So in a way, I had a roundabout link with Archigram that was direct. But that's the kind of sort of fomenting moment where many things were coming together. Archigram was part of the British pop movement. It really wasn't that political. The politics were the politics of pop culture, the Beatles, and kind of the commercial culture, plus the space program that the US had launched, and of course it was in the space race with the Russians. So in a curious way, there's very little political content in Archigram. There are certain implications in Archigram. I think my instinct is to explore other ideas in architecture other than those that were current at the time came not so much from something like ARCA Graham as from my own experience once I was out of school and working in the profession. Oddly enough, I was not influenced by political movements. I was not activist in the 60s. I was married, I had 2 children, I was in School of Architecture, I was totally focused on architecture. I was never a political activist, I was never a hippie. No, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't be again either. Because I felt that the crucial way that I could be political was through my work. And there may come a time when one has to, stand on the barricades. And when that time comes, you hope that you'll recognize it. So I'd like to address the political dimension of my work and where that maybe emerged from. I think it emerged more from the ethical side of my interests. Because to most people, political implies literally the machinery, the political machinery of a society. Parties, Republican, Democrat, socialist, communist, fascist parties, and all those deals that politicians make. They call it the art of the possible, right? That's what politics is called, the art of the possible. Well, some people say that architecture is also the art of the possible. Of course, knowing my work, as you well may, you may say, well, my work is more about the art of the impossible. But nevertheless, that's a political situation that I became aware of more and more, is that if I couldn't find a way to explore the ideas in architecture that interested me and that I felt were important within practice, then that's already a kind of political problem that I've encountered in my own life. And if you begin to see that projected into a larger context, the whole social context, and you see that many people in the society have the same problem. They're not able to fulfill their own desires in terms of the way they're living and what they care about in the context of everyday life. Then you have politics again. So it comes less out of a doctrinaire idea of politics or a particular political ideology than it comes out of just seeing the way people live or what one has experienced oneself in one's own life. So I think that's the way I've come into the political issue. And it's a different idea of party politics is not my interest. It's a different idea of politics, which is the politics of individual action. But I always felt that architecture was something that had an ethical dimension, which was not up to clients, was not up to the state to mandate through licensing or anything else, but was something architects themselves had to address from inside their own work and inside their profession. As far as any political structure that my work could occur in, I think it's occurring in the present political structure. I think the fact that I'm able to have my work published, that people, not everyone, but people see it, they think about it, they take it seriously, at least some people do. I think it's functioning in the present society. But there's no such thing as a real status quo. The fact that it's functioning now doesn't mean it would always function, or some other person would have the same success. It's something we have to fight for on a continuing basis. So we can't relax. We have to continue to work, continue to try to create the conditions under which people can express their ideas. Heterarchy, first of all, is the way I understand it, is a system of organization where people are operating on a common plane, or where the factors are all arrayed laterally on a common plane. They're not arranged in a hierarchical order, with the higher ones being more important than the lower ones, but that we're all occupying the same horizontal space, and that our conversation takes place as it is right now, horizontally, laterally. We're not speaking to someone on a throne. And out of that kind of landscape, comes something called dialogue, and a dialogical relationship between people, which relates, of course, back to this circularity principle in cybernetics, but of feedback. I say something, you say something to me, and out of that emerges something else that neither one of us brought to the situation. So that's very different than the hierarchical structure where a command comes from above, and there's no feedback up to that upper part. It comes down and you execute the command. Military structure, for example, is hierarchical. Although not always. Sometimes in battle, it becomes a lateral structure. And in fact, some cybernetics people, including Heinz Von Foester, have looked at certain kinds of battles, like the Battle of Midway, which it was a battle involving planes, ships, and in a kind of vast ocean terrain where there was no communication. And so the kind of hierarchical function in that particular bit of combat was quite amazing, because they lost their command structure. There was no hierarchy that could work. But anyway, I think that this is the best kind of system for us human beings, yes, this hierarchical system. We still need hierarchical systems, but a hierarchy can be integrated into a hierarchy. In other words, the hierarchical system can embrace a hierarchy. We can all acknowledge that there are certain laws. We're here as free individuals operating in this dialogical way, but at the same time we recognize that there are laws. So we'll obey those laws, even though we have no feedback into them. We're driving a car, there are certain laws, we will obey the laws. We have no influence on them, so we're not operating with them in a hierarchical way. But the odd thing is, hierarchy has a very difficult time embracing hierarchy, because a hierarchy is much more rigid. So it seems to me that the hierarchical structure is more comprehensive, because it can embrace hierarchy, whereas the hierarchy is a more limited type of structure of organization, because it really cannot embrace hierarchy, except under emergency conditions or very rare conditions. So yes, I think this is the best system that we can imagine. And we have it, fortunately. We need more of it, but it's here. That's why we're able to do these things. Well, I think art and design differ in two ways. One is that let me answer it this way. Design might become embraced by art, but art is never design. To be less cryptic, I think that design is usually an action or the making of an artifact which is pointing towards something in the future. It projects. Whereas art is a much more all-embracing idea. Art is complete in itself. Art is the resolution of something. Design is more the process of getting there. But I would say that being an architect, I'm much more involved with that fragmentary aspect of design than of art. Because all of my drawings are projections towards something else. They don't resolve into this category of the finished work of art. I don't think of any of my work as finished in that sense. So I guess it's not art by my own definition. Antonio Santilli was one of the architects I was looking at when I was 21 years old. I mentioned De Stil and Mies, but I was also looking at Santilli's work, mainly those drawings he made of the futurist city, so-called. And naturally, a lot of people have been inspired by those drawings, not necessarily by the specific architecture of the drawings, but by the fact that an architect could visualize this kind of large-scale urban space, but not from a master plan point of view, because he never drew a plan. There was never a plan. He never drew a plan of any of these cities. He just showed perspectival fragments which is something quite amazing. And I think that also influenced my way of, when I was in the early 80s and late 70s making drawings of cities. I think I learned from him, from what he did, that I would only show the fragments. I suppose the project that I have done, which takes up the issue of the fragment in architecture and of whether cities should be built according to overall plans, was the project for Havana. It's in my book Radical Reconstruction. It's also published along with other work of other architects in a book called The Havana Project. Prestel in Munich publishes this book. Because it was then I became fully aware that what I wanted to propose was a kind of, that my drawings were heuristic guides. They were not meant to be executed explicitly as I drew them. They are aids to instruct, to teach about certain particular things, also certain general things. So in the set of drawings that I made for Havana, I did show kind of aerial views, but they're not plans. They weren't whole and complete, solved, finished designs. They're only these heuristic aids to say this is how it might start, this is how it might be. What if this were done? And as an architect, I'm much more interested in offering that as a way to think of each generation building its own city than to try to dictate an end result and say that this is the way that city should be. I am the master architect. Therefore, it must be that way. I'm much more interested in beginning the process than completing it. But one thing that makes my work different from people like, well, I won't name names again, but some other architects, is that I think it's very important to specifically offer an architectonic and an architectural direction. So my drawings are quite specific in terms of how things are formed, or if you look about how things are joined together, how they come together. As opposed to starting with something vague, I think we have to start with something very strong, if it's going to really be heuristic, if it's really going to offer the initial momentum or impetus. You see, it can't just be a diagram or some vague thing. It has to have a tremendous kind of energy in it for it to get the spark. So that is a very different attitude I have towards using drawing in this heuristic way than perhaps some other architects who've tried it. I've had different ideas about whether I want my designs built over the years. In the early 80s, as some of my colleagues and people I respected were starting to build some buildings, I thought, well, I've got to do this. You know, it's just I have to build buildings because that's what an architect does. And naturally, I was a little envious of some of my friends who were starting to build things, and they were doing, extremely interesting architectural designs. These were not just any old buildings. But that fortunately kind of passed with me because, and it was quite natural that it do so. I just explained a moment ago that I'm more interested that my designs become the beginning point of a building process rather than a completed building. Also, it raises the issue of who would build these buildings? Who will build them? Where do the human resources come from? Not just money, but just the labor. It all costs a lot in human terms to build buildings. So where does it come from? And since let me sound a little cynical, since so many good architects are taking care of those clients out there with all that money, I'm more interested in trying to find a different kind of client, as in the Havana Project, where I propose that that this can become a kind of spontaneous architecture. This can be built from small pieces, building up, rather than a great, massive building project requires vast sums of money. So I have begun to look for a different client, but that would mean that the building that gets built would be different than what I designed. It might have some resemblance, or it might not. It's impossible to say. But I feel much more comfortable with that today than I did 10 or 12 years ago, when I was really feeling, oh, I'm going to be left out, you know, I'm not going to be able to build anything. But now I feel quite comfortable with that position. And I do think my work has had some influence, not only on a few other architects, but I think it will have, at least this is what I believe, that I think it will in some way insinuate itself into the built world. You know, and it may not have my name tag on it as the design architect, but it will find its way there. And in that case, I would be very satisfied. Very few architects have my interest in these political, ethical questions. I have the luxury, they would say, of thinking about these things because I'm not trying to get building commissions, which is true. I am more interested in exploring architecture as fully as I can. And I realize I have to sacrifice something to do that. You don't get something for nothing. And in my case, I've had to sacrifice clients, at least in the traditional sense, the ones with a lot of money who can build the things you design. So in that sense, I have almost no colleagues, because the people who I do respect, whether it's familiar names, you've seen me published with them, like Joachim Oblau, Wolf Pricks, and Helmut Svetinsky, or Zaha Hadid, or Tom Main, Eric Moss. They're very different sorts of architects than I am. Now, what I respect about those people is their approach to architecture in general, which has intellectually an exploratory aspect. This idea of invention and having to invent something out of nothing. I respect people who can do that, whether they share my specific interests in cultural theory or cybernetics or anything of that sort. Because if I were counting on finding that, I'd have no colleagues. So I think there is a handful, and hopefully some of the younger people coming up now will have some of that spirit, although given my pessimistic nature, I would say that I don't see any great movements developing along those lines among people of the younger coming generation, the ones who are entering the field now. And that's another topic. Examine what you really want to do within yourself and try to find a way to do it. I was fortunate that I was able, slowly, and with a lot of mistakes, still making a few along the way, but to pursue the things that I wanted to pursue, that I felt were important to me, that gave me a reason to live. And I was able to do that. But part of the reason was that I was just determined that I had to find that way. And I think that's what each of you needs to do also. There's a lot of pressure to not do that. And we're in a profession and in a field of human activity where it's rather difficult to do that. If you were a painter or a sculptor, maybe someone would officially give you more license to do something like that. But architecture is a field where it can be done, if you define what it is that you really want to do and believe in.